Thank you, everybody. It's always good to be with you all. Well, we're headed toward Halloween, right? And this is a time of year when people start to think about things that are darker, things that are violent sometimes. And the purpose of Halloween is to sort of like go nanny nanny boo boo at the darkness. But there is so much happening in this world that we can't always do that. And so I wanted to take a look at violence and how it's happening in the world and how it's happening between people and how we are even feeling it within ourselves. So I want to begin with a reading from a book called Holy Terrors, Thinking About Religion After September the 11th by Bruce Lincoln. Certain kinds of religious discourse can recode problematic acts as righteous deeds or sacred duties, as when killing is defined as a sacrifice, destruction becomes purification, and war becomes crusade. In principle, no religious tradition is more inclined than any other to make arguments of this sort. All people are capable of this move, and the canonic texts of all religions include passages that can be put to such purposes. Those who are interested in undertaking violence can always find arguments and precedents, selective readings that sanctify their purpose. When social groups constitute their identity in religious terms and experience themselves as sacred, the faithful, the righteous, God's chosen people, for instance, they tend to construe their rivals in negative terms. They are heretics, they are infidels, apostates, evil, satanic, etc. And so under such circumstances, the pursuit of self-interest, including vengeance for slights to one's pride or honor, can be experienced as a holy cause in support of which any violence may be justified. The factors that determine whether a group will embark on violent action include the extent to which it feels itself to have been wronged, the extent to which it experiences those wrongs as unbearable, and its ability to define itself and its cause as righteous or sacred. The ugliest and most dangerous situations are not those in which the disadvantaged turn violent, believing that they enjoy divine favor. Worse still are those groups who already enjoy disproportionate power and resources, and yet persuade themselves that religious injunctions like the need to control others or to spread freedom justify their use of superior force, construing aggression as meritorious and holy. When both sides experience their struggle in religious terms, the stage is set for prolonged, ferocious, and enormously destructive combat. From Holy Terrors, Thinking About Religion After September the 11th. So this sermon started for me several months ago as I began to reflect about the anniversary of 9/11. And the fact that this year we also have the first anniversary, just had the first anniversary of October the 7th, which reignited war in Gaza. Such painful things in a world where such things seem in opposition to what the religions of the world claim to teach. So on both of those days, September 11th and October the 7th, terrorist organizations with religious affiliations committed really unspeakable crimes against people that they considered their enemies. So, how, I thought, does such violence start? It doesn't come out of nowhere. And I realized that really at the most basic level, violence starts with a feeling in the body. And while we may not be able to prevent it from arising, we can learn to examine it and examine that feeling and use it as a tool for transformation, even if something in our personal experience or our sense of justice or the religion or ideology which we hold allows or even encourages violence. And we can learn to have compassion and to understand that behind most violent acts there are people who have been living in a hurt room, a hurt room that we perhaps helped to create. So I remember when 9/11 happened, I was living in a city where a respected person of Arabic descent was on the city council. And without excusing what had just happened, she attempted to begin a dialogue explaining some of the pain and grievance that Middle Easterners, largely people of the Muslim faith, had against the West, and how they felt religiously and culturally and economically misunderstood. Well, this woman was asked to step down from her leadership position, and many ostracized her from the social circles were just weeks before she had been a valued member, because at that time the shock was fresh and no one wanted to talk about the backstory. Imagine, as a comparison, people in the 1800s trying to make white America see that they bore some responsibility for the fact that settlements were being attacked by native tribes, for the fact that people were being scalped and killed and kidnapped, because in the moment of those violent things, all people can get their heads around is the barbarity of whatever it is. And it's hard sometimes to reconstruct the truth and the history of how these things all get started. Well, violence is not excusable, but violence does not come out of nowhere. And we can think of many examples where groups of people with religious affiliations saw themselves as righteous in their attacks and their killing of fellow human beings. This didn't just happen on September the 11th or October the 7th, or in all the counterattacks and escalations over this past year. This has happened in India between Muslims and Hindus. It's happened in Bosnia-Herzegovina between Christians and Muslims, in Ireland between Protestants and Catholics, and in the insurrectionist attack on the Capitol a couple of years ago when white Christian nationalists decided that violence was needed so that order and true American patriotism could be restored. So I can feel this push-pull in my body, this reaction, as I think about all the wars that are happening in Ukraine and Gaza, and I reflect on political, religious, cultural animosity and gun violence in this country. And I notice how killing passes for entertainment sometimes on our television screens. People are attracted to violence. It's almost as if we need to work out something primal in our own lives and psyches that we consider forbidden. Well, some people say, well, violence is part of the natural world. It's the way that gene pools are asserted. It's the way the cycle of life and death happens. And they say the history of the world is a history of people and countries wanting and taking, of wounding followed by retribution, and of stronger over weaker. And many will say, well, wouldn't it be nice if there could be justice without the need for force? But that's a fairy tale, isn't it? Sometimes people say, we just need to take justice in our own hands and deliver punishment. But here we sit, and our stated central value as Unitarian Universalists is love. And that encompasses things like pluralism, and compassion, and listening. And it means that we understand that on the one hand there is empire, and on the other hand there is equity. And love encompasses finding paths to justice and tolerance that don't involve holding or settling grudges with knives and guns. So how do we reconcile everything that's happening around us? Do we get involved? Do we ignore it and let it go? Do we try to think about what's happening by writing a sermon about it? So when I can bear to think about it at all, I'm really heavy-hearted, as I'm sure many of you are. And so I wondered where it would lead me if I started thinking about violence, not first of all on a national, cultural, or world religions level, but starting from what I actually knew from my own experience of it. I mean violence that I have felt or committed. Because mild-mannered as I appear to be, I have had moments in my life, and I have felt extreme anger and pain, and when that wells up, it's like something that just needs to get out of your body. And violence is above all visceral, whether you're a person or you're a nation. It's a response to something. If primates and early humans had not been able to summon an aggressive instinct and want to kill or hurt another creature, they wouldn't have been able to defend themselves or find food. And we still do have that primitive wiring in our brains. But fortunately, the prefrontal cortex developed, that part of the brain that enables us to override the amygdala, which is that deep fight-flight center. But the use of that more developed part of our brain doesn't come naturally. It has to be cultivated. We see violence in unregulated little kids. We see it in adults who feel threatened and feel defensive or angry, and they pit their idea or their ego against someone else's. This kind of anger is usually short-lived. It arises from an incident and a response bubbles to the surface almost before we know it. But sometimes, as happens in cultural and religious conflict, that sense of threat stays around, and it starts to feel like a wound. And then it starts to become embedded, always under the surface and likely to erupt. Violence, when we see it on the news, is an extension of something that's been around for a while. Maybe it's even ancestral, that far deep. It's an escape valve or a rationale to get rid of pain, almost like a volcano that feels so much pressure until it finally has to erupt. When violence has grown, we get attacks that seem unexpected, but actually have been long in the making. And that is true whether we're speaking from a personal or community level or on a global scale. Well, I know that there's probably some of you sitting here right now who have been a victim of something at some point in your lives, and you may have experienced violence from someone else, and I grieve that for you. And you've likely thought about, how do I channel that pain? Maybe you even just freeze. You hunker down and hide, or as poet Langston Hughes wrote, when you're crushed, does your dream sag like a heavy load, or does it explode? Well, once when I was about 13, and my parents had put some kind of a damper on me, something they didn't want me to do, and I felt so boxed in. But I knew I could not outburst at my parents without really bad repercussions. I really just wanted to yell and scream and share my feelings. And so I went into the bathroom and I took hold of the towel bar. I started shaking it, and I pulled the thing out of the wall. I just pulled the whole thing out of the wall. Because that's what happens when you're young and there's anger in your body. You just have to do something. But fast forward to not all that long ago, and my marriage was ending, and I was confronting my husband, and I was in such a hurt room over damage that had been done that I yanked open the kitchen drawer and I pulled out a butcher knife, and I just stood there sobbing and holding it in my hand. And I knew I wasn't going to use it, but I felt that. And the world is full of people who are in so much fear and so much pain and danger, who have so much anger and hatred that they would use knives and guns, and they do let themselves. People who are wounded, who are grieving, people who have suffered, people who are angry, who haven't got the bandwidth of their prefrontal cortex to make them stop and remember how to use conciliatory words or just to breathe. People who feel justified, who end up bombing abortion clinics or shooting up a school or storming the U.S. Capitol. There have been case studies of primarily young men who wound up being part of violent mass killings, and often there's a lethal combination of personal, political, and religious motivation. So we can look at those who have been recruited by Al-Qaeda or Hamas. We can look at someone like Timothy McVeigh, who bombed the federal building in Oklahoma, or maybe the standoff between the FBI and the Branch Davidians. Remember that when it happened in Waco, David Koresh? Often these men struggled to find a sense of agency in their own lives and had been drawn to ideas from their faiths that spoke to the need to tear down whatever it was that existed. Many times the feeling was that the society had become corrupt and secular and was no longer able to move justice correctly, according to them. So those with religious fervor and understanding felt that they had to take matters into their own hands, maybe as murderers, maybe as perpetrators who used suicide. So there was a recent case study of some men who were asked to play a video game involving soccer. And the experience was the ball did not get passed to their avatar. So, in a video game, you become identified with a little character. And so the ball in the game did not get passed to their avatar. They just got left out. So they took MRI scans of their brains before and after. And then they gave them a questionnaire where answers indicated that they were now, after being excluded, were more susceptible to recruitment messages from radical religious organizations where violence might be encouraged or deemed necessary. Because what happens is that in our relationships with others, sometimes along the way, people start to feel unseen, they start to feel unheard, they feel powerless, and so they start to associate themselves with groups and ideas that give them a sense of purpose. Those who have carried out such heinous acts say that they were defending in their mind what they saw as a high ideal. They're punishing the evildoers, what their sacred texts and their holy leaders had told them was the right thing to do. And getting rid of that anguish in their bodies through violence was actually done in the name of religious retribution. And that's where, for me, things become most problematic, when a person's own pain gets linked to religious doctrine. Through religion, wounded people absolve themselves of responsibility and they consider violence a holy task. They decide that violence and anger is a justifiable response for some wrong. And we see this happening right now. It's the kind of anger that gets intellectualized against those who are other, those who are not like you and are therefore viewed as competitors or enemies. It's the kind of violence that happens when a nation or a religious group decides to do harm to others as a way to deliver justice. This happens when people forget that we cannot attack someone else without attacking ourselves. Violence as a response to violence is not an answer, but it doesn't come from nowhere. It is a mixture of fear and grief that can start to take the form of retribution. As Unitarian Universalists, we don't exactly accept violence, but we have, because we live in the society we do, we become acclimated to it. And empathy, well, that can be a luxury. So let's not become complacent. We can use these powerful feelings of anger and take that energy for growth and transformation. If we want the world to be kinder, we must start by looking first at ourselves individually to understand where anger comes from, an impulse. And then we must look at other individuals and understand and see their pain and realize that every act of violence has a backstory. Every killer has a childhood, has wounds and anxiety that went unseen. And we must look at ourselves as Americans and know the facts about some of the attitudes we see and how we too are participating in violence, even if indirectly at times. Because I see leaders validating violence on a national level, messages that have been taken out of Christian scripture and interpreted as permission to act against those we see as enemies or as signs that what happened to us is a type of punishment from God. Some years back, Christian dispensationalism came into secular popularity with the publication of a series of books called Left Behind. Some of you may have heard of that. Well, dispensationalism posits that we're living in really apocalyptic times and that the forces of darkness are trying to take over. And their belief is that a nation rooted in the high principles of Christian thought must claim the right to wage war. Because after 9/11, there were Christian evangelists speaking on television saying that the attacks that had happened were a wake-up call. And America had fallen away from God, and we needed to repent and to pray and to create a spiritual shield around our nation. And there was nothing inherently violent in that request to pray, but those kinds of attitudes did strengthen the sense, the inclination to feel that America needed to be more Christian in order to stand up against those who would harm us. And those insidious messages of Christian nationalism have continued to creep into our laws and into our prevailing point of view, because there is nothing inherently violent in the decision to place posters of the Ten Commandments in classrooms or teach the Bible in public schools, as was recently decided here in Houston. There's nothing inherently violent in disallowing help to transgender youth, nothing inherently violent in revoking Roe v. Wade or in selling arms to Israel or sending immigrants back to their home countries. But all of these things press buttons for me because they seem to say that America should be more biblical. And there is nothing that leads to actual violence more than some fearful or authoritarian people who take up sides with religious righteousness and call it proper justice. Well, all of this happening makes me feel unsafe. It makes me feel threatened in my freedom and told that I have to confine myself to a dogma that's pushing up against the separation of church and state. And so once again, I can feel in my body that beginning of tension, that violence that makes me vigilant and angry and leery that there are those who want to control us and restrict our freedoms or treat fellow human beings as outsiders. Transformation. The time is now. Nonviolence must start to be an inseparable part of our being. And so I do think about the responsive reading that we just had from Gandhi, his teachings on how to resist oppression. I remember the people of South Africa facing down apartheid, Black Americans who in the face of slavery and Jim Crow and mass incarceration channeled their anger into gospel or blues or rap. And they used their pain and that retaliatory impulse, which should have been so natural, as a kind of transforming fire. Because nothing strikes terror into the heart of an oppressor like a song or a voice that won't be silenced, because it lets them know that love is present and truth is present. And so notice the hurt rooms. Notice the ones that you yourself are in when you feel that feeling in your own body. Notice it when you're sensing it between people, when you have it with your neighbor. You can't always see it. And when nations create hurt rooms under the banner of religion and call it asserting proper behavior, call that out. Call it fear, call it ignorance, call it misguided religious nationalism. Then take this moment for what it is, an opportunity for personal, for community, and for national transformation. Amen.